All right, looking at women in World War II. Before we talk about the context, I want to talk about some of the themes of this era for women. It's really a paradox of change. War is a watershed event, right? We see new opportunities, especially for women, for people of color, but we also see continued discrimination. On the one hand, we see the accelerated World War II accelerated the process of women being incorporated into the workforce, yet it doesn't alter gender ideology. So although gender is not rethought, it's not being socially reconstructed during this time, women's experiences with work and their greater independence as a result of that lays the seeds for 1960s feminism. So a little bit of historical context. We see the US going from isolationist, meaning not wanting to be involved in any world affairs, to war as a result of the Japanese bombing of Pearl Harbor on December 7th, 1941. Immediately following the bombing, we see the US government issuing an order to round up all Japanese and Japanese American people to internment camps out of fear that there could be, espionage or spy after declaring war on Japan. We see an unprecedented role for the federal government mobilizing for war, an increased presence of the federal government in big businesses, in the workplace, really in all areas of life. Very similar to World War I, we see production and business really booming. The U.S. was instrumental in bringing food and supplies and ammunition to the Allied forces in Europe. And we also see the Office of the War Information really helping to perpetuate this idea of World War II being the good war, as it's known. And so this Norman Rockwell painting of the four freedoms for why the U.S. was fighting really kind of sums up the job of the Office of War Information, right? The U.S. is going to spread the New Deal, spread these sort of ideology of freedom and democracy to the world. And adding on to that, freedom from want, freedom from fear was something that the U.S. was fighting for. We also see the Executive Order 8802, which made it illegal to discriminate by race in defense production, any kind of defense work, being a real step towards civil rights and greater racial equality on the part of the legislature during this time period. So it's the first piece of federal action around race, really, since Reconstruction after the following the Civil War. Okay, women's participation in the Good War. Men were very upset to see women in their factories. It meant that the men that used to work next to them were away fighting and possibly losing their lives. But women were, by and large, called upon to fill those gaps and take on what would traditionally be seen as men's work, right? Factory jobs that typically were not open to women became open to women out of necessity for war production. And the marketing of these factory jobs gave women purpose, right? While their husband, their boyfriend, their fathers were away, it was a way to support the war. Married women could support their husbands fighting by getting a job, right? These Rosies, the Rosie the Riveters, were the women that were participating in any way they can in the war. Society really built up women's independence from men during this time, right? They had to. So we see kind of this more somewhat independent looking image here of Rosie the Riveter that she could be more confident. We can do it, right? We don't need to be dependent on a man, is sort of the ideology that's being perpetuated during this time period, which is, somewhat conflicting with what we'll see the post World War II ideology kind of spewing out. But there's more jobs available for women in defense and aircraft and shipbuilding. Even though they're being paid overall 55% less than men, they were still getting more money than they would have in other jobs before the war. So we see canning, sewing, clerical work, professional work. We actually see a decline of women working in domestic service, particularly for women of color. This is an opportunity to get into new fields of work during the war. But the jobs pay less to women. It's not enough to make a living. Again, they're considered to be not to be the primary breadwinners. And for women of color, particularly Black women, they're paid even less. But they do have union support in the factory jobs. And though some work is segregated, Black women were often doing the heavier work, the dirtier work. There was some progress there. When it comes to women in unions, we see a lot more union activity of women as well. In 1940, there were 800,000 union members that were women. By 1950, 3 million women were union members, which accounted for 22% of all union members. So many union men were ambivalent about organizing and including women, or changing traditional family ideals. But the ideology of domesticity really worried some veterans that were coming back, that would they be able to get their job after the war was over. So there is some greater acceptance of women in unions during World War II, but there's still a fear that women could be replacing men or really challenging the traditional gender roles and stereotypes. We see women's participation in the war outside of the workplaces as well. In everyday life, women are making changes to adapt. They're relocating, moving in order to work. There's one example of a woman who leaves her kids back in New York with her parents, with the kids' grandparents, to go to California to work in a shipyard. California, especially Oakland, the Bay Area, and Los Angeles become real hotspots for wartime production during World War II. We see rising incomes. Wages are going up, especially with the help of unions. Women are able to buy more, and they really come into the middle class. 70% is the average rise in women's weekly earnings during World War II. So that gave women really that sense of independence, that they could make enough money to have purchasing power and buy the things they otherwise wouldn't have been able to. We see changes in marriage and family patterns as well, that people are marrying quickly. Before loved ones go off to war, there's a sense of urgency to rush into marriage. So we see marriage rates go up and continue to go up even after the war. We also see couples rushing into having kids and having more of them during this time period. It's a precursor to the baby boom that will happen after the war. But we're also seeing a rise in divorce rates. People felt the ability to end unhappy marriages, and did so. Which makes sense, right? If people are quicker to rush into marriage, maybe there's going to be an increase in divorce rates. We also see more married women working outside the home during this time period, obviously. This is a very important change, and this is going to kind of set the seeds in motion for a change of married women working permanently, that this will become more acceptable after World War II. By 1950, 52% of employed women were married, and the median age was 36 and a half years old, and 25% of those had children under the age of 18. So women accepted the fact that men wouldn't help with the domestic workload, the dishes, the housework, and so forth. So what that meant really was that women are having to take on extra work, essentially, right, with the children, with the household, and then also with their work outside the home as well. We see other areas where women are helping in the war effort. Growing victory gardens. There was a wartime shortages. This idea that we need to save and ration for the troops overseas. So increase in victory gardens to produce your own vegetables and help cut down on consumption. Women start canning their own food, making their own clothes. We see women working at the Red Cross, selling war bonds. You're really working in various capacities to participate in the war.